February 1945. The war was supposed to be nearing its end, but in the Pacific, the closer we got to Japan, the harder the fighting became. The next target was an ugly pork-chop-shaped rock located 750 miles south of Tokyo. It was officially named Iwo Jima, but the men who fought there called it Sulfur Island. Even before you saw it, you could smell it. A rotten egg stench that drifted over the ocean, mixing with the smell of cordite and diesel fuel. It was a geological nightmare. A volcanic island that was still alive, venting steam and sulfur gas from fissures in the ground. There was no fresh water, no cover, just volcanic ash and jagged rock. But we needed it. The Army Air Forces needed it as an emergency landing strip for the B-29 bombers flying the long, dangerous raids over Japan. We were told it would be tough, but we had the might of the entire U.S. Navy behind us. For 74 consecutive days, B-24 Liberators bombed the island. For 3 days before the landing, battleships and cruisers poured the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the war onto that 8 square miles of rock. We looked at the island through binoculars. It was a smoking ruin. We thought nothing could survive that. We didn't know that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was waiting for us. Kuribayashi was brilliant. He knew he couldn't stop us on the beaches. He knew naval gunfire would destroy anything on the surface. So, he went underground. He built 11 miles of tunnels inside the island. He connected caves, bunkers, and artillery positions into a massive subterranean honeycomb. His 21,000 soldiers were sitting comfortably 30 feet underground, waiting for the shelling to stop. D-Day, February 19, 1945. The Armada was the largest ever assembled in the Pacific. 450 ships. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches at 09 Zurai. The beaches of Iwo Jima were unique. They weren't sand. They were deep, soft, black volcanic ash. It was like stepping into quicksand. You sank up to your ankles. If you tried to run, you sank to your knees. Vehicles, jeeps, and tanks bogged down instantly, their treads churning helplessly in the black grit. For the first 20 minutes, there was relative silence. It was Kuribayashi's trap. He let the first waves land. He let the beaches get clogged with men and equipment. He let us get comfortable. Then, he sprung the trap. Suddenly, Mount Suribachi, the 550-foot dormant volcano dominating the southern end of the island, erupted. Not with lava, but with artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire. Kuribayashi had turned the mountain into a massive multi-story fortress looking right down our throats. The beaches turned into a slaughterhouse. There were no foxholes to dig. The ash just collapsed back into the hole. There was no cover. Men were cut in half by heavy machine guns. Mortar shells landed silently in the soft ash before exploding, spraying razor-sharp volcanic rock like shrapnel. The noise was indescribable. The screams of the wounded mixed with the roar of naval guns trying to suppress the mountain. By noon, the beaches were a wreckage of burning vehicles, destroyed landing craft, and shredded bodies half buried in the black dust. We realized then, this wasn't an island. It was a trapdoor to hell. The priority was the mountain. Mount Suribachi. It loomed over everything. It seemed to watch you wherever you moved. As long as the Japanese held that high ground, they could direct accurate artillery fire onto every inch of the southern beaches. The job of taking it fell to the 28th Marines of the 5th Division. It wasn't a climb. It was a vertical assault against a fortified bunker complex. The Japanese had ringed the mountain with intricate defensive belts, pillboxes with 3-foot-thick concrete walls, covered in sand and rocks so they were invisible until they opened fire. Spider holes connected by tunnels. You couldn't see them. You would just see a puff of smoke on the hillside, and 3 Marines next to you would drop. The only way to take them out was close-quarters combat of the most brutal kind. We used the blowtorch and corkscrew method we learned on Paliliu, perfected here. Artillery and naval guns would blast the face of the mountain to strip away camouflage. Then, tanks and infantry would suppress the bunker ports with machine gun fire. Finally, the demolition teams and flamethrowers would move in. A Marine with a flamethrower strapped to his back, the most dangerous job on Earth, would crawl up the slope, under fire, get within 20 yards of the bunker slit, and unleash a stream of liquid fire. The screams coming from inside those bunkers were horrific, echoing off the canyon walls. Immediately after the fire, an engineer would run up and throw a satchel charge inside to collapse the tunnel and ensure no one came out alive. It was slow, agonizing work. Yard by yard, bunker by bunker. It took 4 days of this butchery to reach the summit. On the morning of February 23rd, a 40-man patrol from E Company, led by Lieutenant Harold Schreer, finally fought their way to the crater's rim. They found a piece of Japanese water pipe and attached a small American flag they had brought from the transport ship. At 10:20 a.m., they raised it. Down below, on the beaches and on the ships, thousands of Marines saw that tiny speck of red, white, and blue against the gray sky. A roar went up. Ships blew their horns. Men cheered and wept. For a moment, they thought the battle was over. But history is complicated. That first flag was small, and some brass wanted it as a souvenir. So, a second larger flag was ordered up the mountain later that afternoon. Joe Rosenthal, an AP photographer, went up with them. He almost missed the shot. He spun around just as 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman struggled to plant the heavy pipe in the rocky ground. Click. It became the most famous photograph of the war, a symbol of victory. But for the men standing on top of Suribachi that day, there was no feeling of final victory. As the cheering on the beaches died down, the men on the summit turned around and looked north. What they saw made their blood run cold. Suribachi was just the southern tip. To the north lay the Motoyama Plateau, a broad, twisted landscape of rocks, canyons, and sulfur pits. It was Kuribayashi's main defensive line, the meat grinder. We had taken the mountain, but we had only just opened the door to the main killing fields of Iwo Jima. After the flag went up on Suribachi, a strange thing happened. The guys in the rear, the sailors on the ships, they started celebrating. They thought the war was over, but for the Marines on the line, looking north, the war hadn't even started. We turned our backs on the volcano and faced the Motoyama Plateau. It wasn't a mountain, it was a wasteland, a twisted, confusing labyrinth of jagged rocks, sulfur pits, and canyons that looked like the surface of a dead planet. The Japanese called it their sanctuary. We called it the meat grinder, and we were about to be fed into it. General Kuribayashi had designed the ultimate killing zone. He anchored his defense on 3 specific points: Hill 382, a ruined radar station known as the Turkey Knob, and a depression in the ground called the Amphitheater. Together, they formed a deadly triangle. If you attacked one, you were hit from the other 2. It was a crossfire that no man could walk through and live. We stepped off into the attack on February 24th. We measured our advance not in miles, or even yards, but in inches. To move 10 feet might cost 10 lives. The terrain was the enemy. The ground was hot to the touch. Steam hissed from cracks in the rocks, smelling of rotten eggs. You couldn't dig a foxhole because the rock was too hard. Or if you did, the ground was so hot it would blister your skin. And the Japanese were invisible. They used smokeless powder. You would hear the crack of a rifle, and the man next to you would drop with a hole in his head, but you couldn't see a muzzle flash. You couldn't see where it came from. You fired blindly at rocks, at shadows, at nothing. They had buried their tanks, Type 95 Hago tanks, up to their turrets in the ground, turning them into steel pillboxes camouflaged with rocks. They waited until we were right on top of them before opening fire with 37mm cannons. It was point-blank slaughter. I remember the assault on Hill 382. It was the highest point in the northern sector. We threw everything we had at it: artillery, naval gunfire, airstrikes with 1,000-pound bombs. The hill was pulverized. It was stripped of every blade of grass. But the Japanese were still there, deep underground. Every time we took the summit, they would counterattack from tunnels we didn't know existed. They would pop up behind us, throwing grenades, screaming, hacking with swords. We took that hill and lost it 4 times in 1 week. The casualties were unsustainable. Companies that started with 250 men were commanded by corporals because every officer was dead. The replacements, kids fresh from boot camp who had never heard a shot fired in anger, were thrown into the line. Some of them died before they even learned the names of their squad leaders. I saw a replacement stand up to look for a target. He lasted 3 seconds, A sniper bullet took his throat out. He didn't even have time to be afraid. He just looked surprised, and then he was gone. We stopped learning their names. It hurt too much to learn a name and then zip it into a body bag 2 hours later. The nights were a different kind of horror. The Japanese didn't do banzai charges here. They were wolves. They infiltrated. They slithered on their bellies through the sulfur mist. They carried knives and satchel charges. You would be sitting in your hole, eyes burning from the sulfur fumes, staring into the dark. You'd hear a sound, a rock clicking. Was it a lizard? Was it the wind? Or was it a man with a knife? The paranoia was absolute. We threw grenades at everything. If a flare popped, you froze. If you moved, the machine guns on Turkey Knob would cut you in half. Friendly fire became a plague. In the confusion and the terror, terrified Marines shot at anything that moved. We killed our own. And the smell got worse. There was no way to bury the dead in the rocky ground. Bodies lay in the open, bloating in the sun, covered in black volcanic flies. The smell of death mixed with the sulfur steam created a stench so thick you could taste it. We wore gas masks just to breathe, just to keep from vomiting while we fought. But the most terrifying weapon on Iwo Jima wasn't the machine gun. It was the Zippo tank. The M4 Sherman with a flamethrower. It was the only way to clear the bunkers. The tank would rumble up to a cave opening. Impervious to the small arms fire pinging off its hull, it would unleash a stream of napalm 150 yards long. The psychological effect was devastating. We watched the fire pour into the earth. We heard the screams, muffled, distant wails coming from deep underground. Sometimes the Japanese would run out, burning, human torches flailing in the black ash. We shot them to put them out of their misery. It was a mercy. We were becoming numb. We weren't men anymore. We were machines of destruction. We ate cold rations with bloody hands. We slept next to corpses. We killed without feeling. The meat grinder was doing its job. It was grinding us down, body and soul. We looked at the calendar. It had been 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and Kuribayashi was still there, still watching us from the Turkey Knob, still waiting. We knew we would win. We had nowhere else to go, but we also knew that to finish this, we would have to kill every single one of them. There would be no surrender on Iwo Jima, only death. While we were bleeding on the surface, scratching for inches on the Motoyama Plateau, the Japanese were fighting a different war beneath our feet. General Kuribayashi had built a masterpiece of engineering, 11 miles of tunnels. It wasn't just holes in the ground, it was a subterranean city. He had built multi-level command centers with electricity, ventilation shafts, and hospitals carved into the volcanic rock. But by March, the Americans had cut the power. We had blocked the ventilation, and most critically, we had captured the only water wells. The underground city turned into a stifling, pitch-black tomb. Down there, the heat was geothermal. It was 120 degrees. The air was thick with sulfur fumes, cigarette smoke, and the stench of thousands of unwashed, dying men. We found diaries later that described the madness. Men were licking the condensation off the cave walls. They were drinking their own urine. They were fighting each other for a damp rag to suck on. But they didn't surrender. Kuribayashi's order was absolute. We will die here, but we will take them with us. The war changed from a battle of maneuver to a battle of extermination. We stopped trying to enter the caves. It was suicide. The tunnel rats who went in usually didn't come back. They were met with bayonets in the dark or booby traps rigged to bodies. So, we decided to seal them in. We brought up the armored bulldozers. It was a grim mechanical process. A tank would fire into the cave mouth to keep the Japanese heads down. Then, the bulldozer would rumble forward, its massive blade pushing tons of rock and dirt over the entrance. We were burying them alive. Sometimes we could hear them screaming inside as the light was cut off. Sometimes they would try to dig their way out with their bare hands, only to be shot by the guards we left behind. We sealed hundreds of caves. We sealed thousands of men inside the earth. It felt wrong. It went against every instinct of a soldier to kill an enemy you couldn't see, an enemy who was trapped. But we had no choice. If we left a cave open, They would come out at night and slit our throats. It was us or them. And on Iwo Jima, mercy was a luxury we couldn't afford. Deep in the northern sector, in a gorge we called Death Valley, General Kuribayashi moved his final command post to a small damp cave. He was a samurai. He had lived in America. He had dined with American officers before the war. He knew he couldn't win. He had known it from the start. He wasn't fighting for victory. He was fighting for time. Every day he held Iwo Jima was one more day the B-29s couldn't bomb Tokyo. His uniform was ragged. He was starving like his men. But his spirit was unbroken. On March 16th, he sent a radio message to the garrison on Chichijima. The battle is approaching its end. At midnight on the 17th, I will lead the final charge. I pray for the eternal prosperity of the empire. He tore off his rank insignias. He wanted to die as a simple soldier, but the end wasn't glorious. It was messy and confused. The Japanese remnants didn't launch a banzai charge in the traditional sense. They launched a silent charge. On the night of March 25th, 300 Japanese soldiers, led by Kuribayashi, though his body was never identified, infiltrated the American rear lines near the airfield. They didn't scream. They crept into the tents where the pilots and the mechanics were sleeping. They slashed tents with swords. They threw grenades into the mess hall. It was a massacre in the dark. Pilots, who had never held a rifle in combat, were fighting for their lives in their underwear. Cooks were fighting with knives. It was a chaotic, bloody brawl that lasted until dawn. When the sun came up, 262 Japanese soldiers lay dead around the tents. 53 Americans were killed. It was the last gasp of the underground city. The organized resistance was over, but the island was still dangerous. For weeks afterwards, stragglers would emerge from the sealed caves like ghosts. They were skeletons, covered in sores, holding rusted grenades. They would stumble towards us, too weak to throw, just wanting to die in the sunlight. We looked at them, and we didn't see monsters anymore. We saw men who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. We saw the price of loyalty to an emperor who was thousands of miles away. On March 26, 1945, the island was declared secure, but that word, secure, felt like a lie. We were still killing Japanese stragglers in the caves 2 months later. In fact, the last 2 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima wouldn't surrender until 1949, 4 years after the war ended. That is how deep the tunnels went. That is how fanatical the enemy was. But the heavy fighting was over. The guns finally went silent. And in the silence, we tried to comprehend what we had just done. We looked at the butcher's bill. For 36 days of combat, on an island only 8 square miles in size, the United States Marine Corps paid a price that shook the nation. 6,821 Marines and Navy personnel killed, 19,217 wounded, total American casualties, over 26,000. For the first time in the Pacific War, the total number of American casualties exceeded the total number of Japanese defenders. We killed them all. Of the 21,000 men Kuribayashi led, only 216 were taken prisoner during the battle. The rest died in their caves, faithful to the end. We walked through the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Division cemeteries, row after row of white crosses and stars of David stretching out toward the volcano. It was a city of the dead. I looked at the names. Kids I went to boot camp with, sergeants who had taught me how to tie my boots, officers who had led from the front, all gone. For what? We were told the island was crucial for the B-29s, and it was. By the end of the war, 200 B-29 bombers had made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. They say that 24,000 airmen's lives were saved because they had a place to land. Every Marine who died on that black sand bought life for an airman in the sky. That was the math of war. And then there was the photograph. Joe Rosenthal's picture of the flag raising on Suribachi. By the time we got off the island, that picture was on every newspaper in America. It was famous. The men in it were heroes, but the reality was tragic. Of the 6 men in that photo, 3 of them, Franklin Sousley, Harlan Block, and Michael Strank, never left the island alive. They were killed in the meat grinder days after the photo was taken. The survivors, Ira Hayes, Rene Gagnon, John Bradley, were pulled off the line and sent home to sell war bonds. They were paraded through stadiums, cheered by millions. But they didn't feel like heroes. They felt like frauds. Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian, couldn't handle it. He drank to drown the memories of his friends who died while he was eating steak dinners in New York. He died young, a casualty of Iwo Jima, just as surely as if he had been hit by a bullet. They didn't want to be called heroes. They said the real heroes were the ones who never came back. As we boarded the transport ships to leave, I looked back at the island one last time. It looked exactly as it had when we arrived, in ugly, smoking, sulfurous rock. But it was different now. It was hallowed ground. We filled small jars with the black volcanic ash to take home, not as a souvenir of victory, but as a reminder of the hell we had survived. We scrubbed the grit off our skin, but we knew we could never scrub the memories from our minds. Admiral Chester Nimitz, looking at the reports of the battle, said the words that would become the epitaph of the Marine Corps. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. It was true. There were no cowards on Iwo Jima. There was nowhere to hide. We left our youth on those black beaches. We left our innocence in those caves. But we carried something with us too. A bond. A knowledge that we had looked into the deepest abyss of human violence, and we had not blinked. 75 years later, the island is silent again. The jungle has reclaimed the trenches. The sulfur still vents from the ground. But if you listen closely to the wind blowing over Mount Suribachi, you can almost hear them. The voices of the boys of 1945, forever young, forever Marines. This concludes our series on the Battle of Iwo Jima. Thank you for watching Beneath the Metal. We tell these stories so that the uncommon valor of the past is never forgotten by the future. Please subscribe, share, and salute the fallen. Semper Fi.